I used to think endings would be obvious. Something you could point to. A moment you could replay and say, that's where everything changed. But that's not how it happened for me. There wasn't a scene. No shouting. No final words that felt like closure. Just a quiet shift I didn't notice until it had already taken something from me. These days, it's the small things I feel the most. Making coffee and realizing I only ever pour one cup now. Sitting in a room that used to feel shared, but somehow doesn't anymore. It's strange how something ordinary can start to feel unfamiliar, like it belongs to a version of your life you don't have access to anymore. I didn't lose everything all at once. That would have been easier to understand. It happened slowly. So slowly that I kept adjusting without even realizing I was giving things up. Time. Energy. Parts of myself I thought I could always come back to. I kept telling myself it was normal. That this is what commitment looks like. That people change. That relationships go through phases. And maybe they do. But I think there's a point where you stop growing together and start disappearing quietly inside something that no longer feels the same. I just didn't know when I crossed that point. Or maybe I didn't want to. Because the truth is, there was a moment. Not a big one. Not something anyone else would have noticed. It didn't come with proof or certainty. Just a feeling I couldn't explain. A pause where there shouldn't have been one. A response that felt slightly off. I remember standing there, trying to shake it off. Telling myself I was overthinking it. That I was tired. That I was imagining things. Because once you start questioning something like that, you can't really go back. And I didn't want to be the kind of person who looks for problems where there aren't any. So I let it go. Or at least, I told myself I did. But something had already shifted. Not in what I knew. In what I felt. That sense of ease, the one that made everything feel solid without needing to think about it, was gone. And once that disappears, you start noticing things differently. You listen a little closer. You pay attention to things you used to ignore. Not because you want to find something. But because part of you is already afraid you might. I wish I could say I handled that moment better. That I trusted myself. Or that I walked away before things got worse. But I didn't. I stayed where I was. And I kept pretending that what I felt didn't matter. Even when it started to. Even when it became harder to ignore. Because it's not the truth that breaks you. It's the time you spend standing right next to it, choosing not to see it. And by the time I finally did, something important was already gone. Not just the relationship. Something in me. The version of me that didn't second-guess everything. The one who believed that if something was wrong, it would be obvious. I don't think like that anymore. Now I know how quiet it can be when things start to fall apart. How easily you can miss it. How long you can live inside something that's already broken, without realizing you're the only one still holding it together. And maybe that's the part that stays with you. Not what they did. Not even how it ended. But how close you were to the truth. And how long it took you to admit you could feel it before you could prove it. So if you've ever ignored that feeling, if you've ever told yourself you were just overthinking, just being paranoid, you might understand exactly what I mean. And if you don't, you probably will. Because stories like this don't start with betrayal. They start with something small. Something easy to dismiss. Something that doesn't feel like enough, until it is. If you want to hear how something that small turned into everything falling apart, make sure you're subscribed to Cheating Stories with Ray, like the video, and share it with someone who thinks they'd notice the signs sooner than I did. Because I used to think that too. And I was wrong. When I think back to how it started, nothing about it felt unusual. That's probably why I trusted it so easily. There was no intensity that made me question things. No chaos. No sense that I was stepping into something unstable. It felt steady. Predictable in a way that made it easy to relax into. And at the time, that's exactly what I thought I needed. I had spent a long stretch of my life trying to figure things out, work, direction, who I was supposed to be. So when this came along, it felt like something solid I could build around. Not just be part of. Rely on. We fell into routines quickly. Simple ones. The kind that don't feel important while they're happening, but end up shaping everything. Checking in during the day. Evenings that followed a rhythm. Conversations that didn't need effort because they were just there. It felt easy to be understood. Or at least, that's what I believed. Looking back, I think I filled in a lot of the gaps myself. Interpreted things in the best possible way because I wanted it to be real. And for a while, I don't think that was entirely wrong. There were good moments. Enough of them to make everything feel balanced. Enough to convince me that whatever I was putting into it was being returned, even if not always in the same way. I didn't question the differences. If I was more expressive, I told myself they were just more reserved. If I made more effort to keep things connected, I framed it as being committed. I think I liked that version of myself. The one who showed up. Who stayed consistent. Who didn't give up easily. It made me feel dependable. Needed, even. And that became a big part of it. Not just being in the relationship, but being the one who held it together. At first, that role didn't feel heavy. It felt like purpose. If something felt off, I adjusted. If there was distance, I closed it. If things got quiet, I filled the space. I didn't see that as imbalance. I saw it as care. Because in my mind, relationships weren't about keeping score. They were about showing up, even when the other person couldn't. So I kept showing up. Over time, though, that way of thinking started to shape more than just how I acted. It started shaping who I was. I began organizing my life around us without really noticing it. Plans became flexible depending on what they needed. Time with other people got pushed back or canceled without much thought. Things I used to do for myself slowly became things I just didn't have time for anymore. And I didn't resent it. That's the part that's hard to explain. It didn't feel like I was losing anything. It felt like I was choosing something more important. I told myself this is what building a future looks like. You prioritize. You adapt. You invest. And I did. Fully. There wasn't a part of me that held back just in case. I didn't keep distance as protection. I trusted completely. Not just in them, but in what I believed we had. That it was stable. That it was mutual. That it was something we were both working toward, even if we showed it differently. And the more I believed that, the less I questioned anything that didn't quite line up. Small things that might have stood out before just didn't. I gave them meaning that made sense to me. I explained them away before they could turn into doubt. Because doubt didn't fit the version of the relationship I had built in my head. And I was invested in that version. More than I realized at the time. Because once you build your identity around something like that, around being the steady one, the understanding one, the one who doesn't walk away, you don't just protect the relationship. You protect the role you've created inside it. And without realizing it, I had started protecting that role, more than I was protecting myself. I just didn't see the difference yet. Not until much later. When holding everything together started to feel a lot like holding it alone. At some point, the balance shifted. Not in a way I could point to. Just in how things started to feel. The routines were still there. The conversations, the check-ins, the sense that we were still moving forward. On the surface, nothing had really changed. But underneath that, something was different. I think it started with small adjustments. The kind you don't question. If they were busy, I gave more space. If they seemed distant, I tried to be more present. If something felt off, I told myself it was temporary. That people go through phases. That not everything needs to be analyzed. And for a while, that mindset worked. It kept things smooth. It kept me from overthinking. But it also meant I kept compensating without realizing it. If they pulled back a little, I leaned in more. If communication got inconsistent, I became the one who kept it steady. I told myself I was just being supportive. That relationships aren't always equal in effort. That sometimes one person carries more, and that's okay. Because eventually, it balances out. At least, that's what I believed. So I didn't keep track. I didn't stop to ask whether things actually were balancing out. I just kept adjusting. And over time, those adjustments became my normal. I stopped expecting certain things. Stopped noticing when effort wasn't returned the same way. Because I had already decided, without saying it out loud, that it was my responsibility to keep things from slipping. And the more I did that, the less I paid attention to what I needed. It didn't feel like sacrifice. It felt like commitment. Like maturity. Like I was doing things the right way. I started turning down plans without thinking twice. Friends would reach out, and I'd say, "I'll let you know," even when I already knew I wouldn't go. Not because I wasn't allowed to. But because I had started prioritizing something else without questioning it. I told myself I preferred it that way. That I didn't need as much outside of the relationship anymore. That what I had was enough. And for a while, I believed that. But there were moments, small ones, where something didn't sit right. I'd notice how easy it was for them to stay busy with their own things. How their life didn't seem to shrink the same way mine had. And I'd catch myself thinking about it. Just briefly. Before pushing it away. Because I didn't want to turn it into something bigger. Didn't want to seem unfair. Or worse, insecure. So I kept it to myself. I stopped bringing things up unless they felt absolutely necessary. Stopped questioning things that didn't quite add up. Because I had convinced myself that trust meant not needing reassurance. That if I had to ask, it meant something was already wrong. And I didn't want to be the one who made it wrong. So instead, I adapted. Quietly. Consistently. Until I got used to being the one who gave more. Not just in time or effort, but in attention. In emotional energy. In patience. I became good at reading subtle shifts. At adjusting my tone, my timing, even my expectations to match where they seemed to be. And the strange thing is, I didn't feel resentful. Not at first. I felt useful. Like I was doing something important. Like I was the reason things stayed stable. But stability built that way is fragile. Because it depends on one person holding more than they should. And I didn't see that yet. I just saw myself becoming more flexible, more understanding, more willing to meet them where they were. Even if that meant leaving parts of myself behind. Things I used to care about started fading into the background. Habits I had before, things that made me feel like myself, became occasional, then rare, then almost non-existent. And I didn't notice when that shift became permanent. Because it didn't happen all at once. It happened in pieces. One adjustment at a time. One decision that didn't feel significant on its own. Until eventually, I had built a version of my life that revolved around maintaining something, instead of being part of something mutual. And by then, it felt normal. That's what makes it hard to see. When you don't feel like you're losing yourself. When it feels like you're just becoming a better partner. More patient. More committed. More understanding. You don't question it. You don't stop and ask whether you're still getting what you need. Because you've already convinced yourself that needing less is a strength. That being okay with less is what makes the relationship work. And once you start believing that, you don't notice how far you've moved from where you started. You just keep going. Adjusting. Until one day, something small doesn't fit the version of things you've been holding on to. And instead of brushing it off like you always have, you hesitate. Because for the first time, it doesn't feel like something you can explain away. After that moment, I started noticing things I hadn't noticed before. Not because they were new, but because I was finally paying attention. At first, it was subtle. The kind of thing you can easily dismiss if you want to. Responses that felt a little delayed. Conversations that ended just slightly earlier than they used to. A tone that was harder to read, like something had shifted just out of reach, but not enough to call out. I told myself it was nothing. People get busy. People get tired. Not everything means something. I repeated that to myself more than I probably should have. Because the alternative was harder to sit with. Still, once that first feeling settled in, it didn't go away. It just changed shape. I started noticing patterns. Not obvious ones, but enough to make me pause. There were moments where I'd say something and get a response that felt disconnected. Not wrong, just slightly out of sync. Like we weren't fully in the same conversation anymore. I remember thinking, maybe I'm just reading too much into it. That became my default explanation. Every time something didn't sit right, I adjusted the story in my head to make it make sense. If they seemed distracted, I told myself they had a lot on their mind. If they pulled back emotionally, I assumed I had missed something or said the wrong thing. I made it about me before it could become about them. Because that felt easier to fix. I could change how I showed up. Be more patient. More understanding. Less demanding. So I did. But the more I adjusted, the more I started noticing how little they had to. Their routine didn't really change. Their energy didn't stretch the way mine did. They moved through things the same way they always had, while I kept recalibrating around them. And I still didn't say anything. Not because I didn't notice. But because I didn't trust what I was noticing. There's a difference. I'd catch myself thinking, this feels off. And almost immediately follow it with, you're overthinking. I didn't want to be wrong. Didn't want to accuse someone of something I couldn't prove. Didn't want to create a problem that didn't exist. So I stayed quiet. Even when the quiet started to feel heavy. There were small moments that lingered longer than they should have. A pause before answering a simple question. A slight shift in body language that didn't match the conversation. Things that didn't add up, but didn't add up enough. That's what made it so confusing. If it had been obvious, I would have known what to do. But this wasn't obvious. It was just uncomfortable. And discomfort is easy to ignore when you've trained yourself to prioritize peace. So I kept choosing peace. Even when it felt like I was the only one working to maintain it. I stopped sharing certain thoughts altogether. Filtered what I said. Chose my words more carefully. Not out of fear, but out of a kind of quiet caution I didn't fully understand yet. Like I was trying not to disturb something fragile. And at the same time, I started feeling more alone in the relationship. Not physically. Just, emotionally. Like I was standing next to someone, but no longer standing with them. I couldn't explain that feeling. So I didn't try. I just carried it. There were moments I considered bringing it up. Starting a conversation. Asking directly if something had changed. But every time I got close, I stopped myself. Because what would I even say? I feel like something's off doesn't sound like enough. It sounds vague. Accusatory. Easy to dismiss. And I didn't want to be dismissed. So I waited. Hoping the feeling would pass. Hoping things would go back to how they were. But they didn't. If anything, the distance became more consistent. Still subtle. Still easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. But I was paying attention now. Even when I didn't want to be. And that's when the internal conflict really started. Because part of me knew something wasn't right. Not in a dramatic, undeniable way. But in a quiet, persistent way that wouldn't leave. And another part of me refused to accept it. Because accepting it meant questioning everything I had built my life around. And I wasn't ready to do that. So I stayed in between. Not fully trusting. Not fully doubting. Just existing in that space where nothing is clear, but nothing feels right either. And that's a hard place to live in. Because you start second-guessing everything. Not just them. Yourself. Your instincts. Your reactions. Your expectations. You wonder if you've changed. If you're becoming difficult. Too sensitive. Too aware. You start shrinking your own thoughts just to keep things steady. And the more you do that, the harder it becomes to tell whether something is actually wrong. Or if you've just convinced yourself that it is. If you've ever been in that space, where something feels off but you can't prove it, where you're stuck between trusting your instincts and doubting them. Take a second and let me know in the comments. And if stories like this hit a little too close to home, make sure you like the video and subscribe to Cheating Stories with Ray. Because sometimes hearing someone else say it out loud is the only way you realize you're not imagining it. I didn't realize that yet. I still thought clarity would come all at once. That eventually, something would happen that would make everything make sense. I just didn't know that by the time it did. It wouldn't feel like clarity. It would feel like something finally breaking through, that had been there the entire time. The moment itself didn't feel dramatic. There was no build-up. No sense that something was about to happen. It came in the middle of something ordinary. The kind of moment I wouldn't have remembered if things had stayed the same. I wasn't looking for anything. That's what stands out the most when I think back on it. I wasn't searching. I wasn't suspicious in that way. I hadn't decided to dig or confront or confirm anything. I was just there. And something didn't line up. It was small. So small that, if I had been even slightly less aware, I might have missed it completely. A detail that didn't match what I'd been told. A gap that shouldn't have been there. At first, I didn't react. I just noticed it. The same way you notice something out of place without fully understanding why it matters. I remember pausing. Looking at it again. Trying to make it make sense in a way that didn't lead anywhere uncomfortable. And for a few seconds, I almost did. I almost convinced myself it was nothing. That there was a reasonable explanation I just hadn't thought of yet. But then something else connected to it. Not at the same time, just close enough. Another small thing. Another detail that didn't quite fit. And suddenly, it wasn't one moment anymore. It was a pattern. Not a clear one. But enough. Enough to make it impossible to ignore. That's when the feeling changed. Not into panic. Not even into anger. Just stillness. Like everything inside me paused at once. Because part of me already knew where it was leading. I just hadn't said it out loud yet. I didn't confront them. I didn't ask questions. I didn't move. I just sat there, going back through everything in my head. Every moment that had felt slightly off. Every time I had told myself I was overthinking. Every explanation I had accepted without really believing. And one by one, they started to fall into place. Not perfectly. But clearly enough. That's the part people don't really talk about. The realization doesn't come all at once. It builds. Piece by piece. Until you reach a point where denying it takes more effort than accepting it. And I think I hit that point right then. Because the more I looked at it, the less I could explain it away. There were too many things that only made sense one way. And I couldn't find a version of it that didn't lead back to the same conclusion. I remember taking a breath, trying to steady myself. But it didn't feel like I was about to break down. It felt like something had already broken, and I was just now noticing it. That's what made it so quiet. So heavy. No shock. No disbelief. Just a kind of hollow understanding. Like I had stepped into a truth that had been waiting for me. I didn't need confirmation. Not in the way I thought I would. Because once I saw it, really saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Everything shifted. Not around me. Inside me. The way I looked at them. The way I replayed conversations. The way I understood the past. It all changed in seconds. And suddenly, things that used to feel confusing started to feel obvious. Not because I had new information. But because I was finally looking at it without trying to protect anything. That's when it hit me. Not what they had done. But how long it had been happening without me letting myself see it. That realization landed harder than anything else. Because it meant the version of things I had been holding on to wasn't real. Not in the way I believed. And I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't know how to react. Because reacting would make it real in a different way. It would force a conversation. A confrontation. Something final. And I wasn't ready for that. So I stayed still. Sat with it. Let it settle. As much as something like that can settle. And the strangest part was, everything around me stayed the same. Nothing changed on the surface. The same space. The same routine. The same person in front of me. But none of it felt the same anymore. Because now I knew. Not everything. Not every detail. But enough. Enough that I couldn't go back to not knowing. And that's the moment everything really ended. Not when we separated. Not when anything was said out loud. But right there. When I realized the truth didn't need to be confirmed to change everything. After that, things didn't fall apart all at once. There wasn't a single conversation where everything came out. No moment where I laid it all on the table and forced it into the open. It unraveled slower than that. Quietly. The same way it had started. At first, I didn't change how I acted. At least, not in a way anyone else would notice. I still showed up the same way. Still followed the same routines. Still responded like nothing had shifted. But inside, everything felt different. I stopped reaching the same way. Stopped filling the silence. Stopped trying to smooth things over before they could become uncomfortable. Not intentionally. It just happened. Like something in me had stepped back. And once it did, I couldn't make it step forward again. They noticed eventually. Not right away. But over time. There were small comments. You've been distant. You seem off. Things like that. I remember nodding. Saying I was just tired. That work had been a lot. That I needed time to reset. I didn't bring up what I knew. Not because I didn't want answers. But because I already understood enough. And I think part of me didn't want to hear it out loud. Didn't want to sit through explanations that would try to reshape something I had already accepted. So instead, I let things drift. And the more I stepped back, the more obvious the gap became. What I used to hold together started loosening on its own. Not because anything new was happening. But because I had stopped compensating for what was already missing. That's when it really hit me. How much of the relationship had been maintained by me. Not completely. But enough that once I stopped, it didn't feel the same anymore. It didn't stabilize. It didn't rebalance. It just thinned out. Conversations became shorter. Time together felt more like routine than connection. And there was this unspoken tension underneath everything. Like we were both aware something had changed, but neither of us was saying it directly. I think they were waiting for me to bring it up. And I think I was waiting for them to. But neither of us did. Not in a real way. And in that silence, something started breaking down that I hadn't expected. Not just the relationship. Me. Because once I stopped focusing on holding everything together, I had nothing left to distract me from what I had been ignoring. The realization didn't just stay in that one moment. It spread. Into how I saw myself. Into how I thought about the time I had given. The energy. The patience. The parts of my life I had set aside without questioning it. I started seeing it all differently. Not as commitment. As something else. Something closer to losing track of myself. That's when the weight really set in. Not anger. Not even sadness, at first. Just this heavy awareness that I had let something become more important than I was. And now I was standing there, trying to figure out who I was without it. Because the version of me that had existed inside that relationship. The one who adapted, who stayed steady, who made things work no matter what. Didn't make sense anymore. That version depended on something I no longer believed in. So I couldn't go back to it. But I also didn't know what replaced it. That in-between space was the hardest part. Still there. But not really present. Still connected. But already detached. And the longer it went on like that, the clearer it became that this wasn't something that could be repaired by effort. Because effort had never been the problem. And for the first time, I understood something I hadn't let myself see before. I hadn't been holding us together. I had been holding on to something that was already slipping away. The actual ending didn't feel like an ending. There wasn't a moment where everything closed cleanly. It was more like stepping out of something that had already been over for a while. By the time we separated, I wasn't trying to fix anything anymore. I wasn't asking questions. I wasn't looking for explanations. I think I already understood what I needed to. And more importantly, I understood what I didn't need anymore. At first, the quiet felt unfamiliar. Not painful in the way I expected. Just different. There was no one to adjust around. No one to anticipate. No one to read between the lines for. I didn't realize how much of my energy had been spent doing that until I stopped. The first few weeks were strange. I kept reaching for habits that didn't exist anymore. Thinking about things I didn't need to think about. It takes time for your mind to catch up with what your life has already changed. But slowly, that space started to feel like something else. Not emptiness. Room. I started doing things I hadn't done in a long time. Simple things. Going out without checking in. Making plans and actually keeping them. Saying yes to people I had been putting off. Reconnecting with parts of my life that had been sitting in the background for longer than I realized. At first, it felt unfamiliar. Like I was stepping back into something I used to know, but didn't fully recognize anymore. But the more I did it, the more natural it became. And with that, something else started to come back. Not all at once. But gradually. A sense of myself that wasn't tied to anyone else. I didn't feel like I had to explain where I was. Or justify how I spent my time. Or adjust my thoughts before I said them out loud. There was a kind of steadiness in that. The kind I used to think came from being in something secure. But it didn't. It came from not needing anything outside of myself to feel settled. That was new. And I didn't fully trust it at first. I kept expecting the old habits to come back. The urge to check in. To accommodate. To shrink certain parts of myself to keep things smooth. But they didn't come back the same way. Because now I could see them for what they were. Not strengths. Not proof of commitment. Just patterns I had learned to survive inside something that wasn't meeting me halfway. Once you see that clearly, it's hard to go back. There were moments I thought about everything that had happened. Not in a way that pulled me back in. More like observing it from a distance. Trying to understand how I let it go on for as long as it did. But I stopped blaming myself the way I might have before. Because I could also see why I stayed. I believed in what I thought we had. I believed that effort meant something. That if I showed up consistently enough, things would stay solid. That belief wasn't wrong. It was just placed in the wrong place. And once I understood that, it became easier to let go of what didn't work. Not just the relationship. The version of me that thought losing myself was part of keeping something together. That's what really changed. I didn't feel like I had lost something anymore. I felt like I had stepped out of something that was slowly taking pieces of me I didn't realize I was giving away. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to get anything back. I was just, not losing anything anymore. I used to think the story would end with her. That there'd be some final moment between us that would define everything that came before it. Maybe forgiveness. Maybe anger. Maybe something that felt like closure. But that's not what happened. There wasn't a scene where everything balanced out. No version of events where one of us won. And for a while, that felt incomplete. Like something was missing. Because I had spent so long believing that the ending of a relationship had to come from the relationship itself. That it had to be explained, resolved, or understood by both people involved. But the truth is, it doesn't. Not always. Closure doesn't always come from the person who hurt you. Sometimes it comes from finally understanding that you don't need anything else from them. Not answers. Not accountability. Not even acknowledgement. I used to think I needed that. That I needed to hear it clearly. Needed it to be said out loud so I could move on. But I didn't. Because by the time everything ended, I had already seen enough. Felt enough. Understood enough. And once you reach that point, waiting for someone else to give you closure just keeps you tied to something you're already trying to leave behind. She did try to stay in my life. In small ways. Messages that didn't really say anything, but still felt like they were trying to keep a connection open. At one point, she said it was for closure. That we should talk. Clear the air. I remember reading that and realizing something had changed in me. Not because I was angry. But because I didn't feel the need anymore. I didn't need her to explain what I had already accepted. I didn't need a conversation to validate something I had already lived through. So I didn't take it. And that might be the part that matters most. Not that things ended. But how they ended. Because for the first time, I wasn't trying to hold on to something just because it had once mattered. I was choosing to let it go, because I mattered. And that wasn't something I would have done before. Before all of this, I probably would have stayed longer. Listened. Tried to understand. Tried to make sense of it in a way that kept the connection alive just a little bit more. But I didn't. Because I finally understood something I hadn't before. That staying isn't always loyalty. Sometimes it's just another way of losing yourself. And I had already done enough of that. The real turning point wasn't finding out what happened. It wasn't the separation. It wasn't even the silence afterward. It was the moment I realized I could walk away without needing anything in return. No explanation. No apology. No final conversation to make it feel complete. Just, the decision to stop giving my time, my energy, and my identity to something that had already taken more than it gave. That was the shift. That was the part that stayed with me. Because once you make that choice, it changes how you see everything. What you tolerate. What you accept. What you're willing to lose, and what you're no longer willing to trade for the sake of keeping something together. So I'll leave you with this. If you had to choose between keeping a relationship the way it is, or keeping yourself the way you used to be, which one would you protect? And more importantly, how long would it take you to realize you've been choosing the wrong one? If this story made you think about something in your own life, don't just scroll past it. Take a second. Like the video, subscribe to Cheating Stories with Ray, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't seeing the truth. It's admitting that you already have, and deciding what you're going to do next.